I turned off the alarm and turned on the bedside lamp. It was already 4 on a cold Saturday morning. With the burden of an elite college basketball player on my shoulders, I had to be up long before the sun every single day. I had to get some shots up and some personal training workouts before joining the team to train by 9. This was my way of staying ahead of the competition. I lived off campus, away from dormitories, away from distractions. My house had a quite spacious backyard, which had a basketball hoop where I did a lot of my work. I quickly headed to the bathroom, turned on the little tap in the sink, and washed my face. The drowsiness soon left my eyes, and I was glaring in the mirror. I then headed back to my bedroom and got my kit on. 2 hours of tough, gruesome professional training later, I laid on the floor of my living room, totally exhausted and drenched in sweat. I reluctantly got up and made for the bathroom. My quadriceps were on fire. I quickly got in, undressed, and turned on the shower. I needed some time to relax and rest for a little bit before the hectic team practice, which would run from 9 till 2 in the afternoon. Division I basketball was something else. We would run a couple plays over and over again till we could run 1,000 plays in our sleep. That was no child's play. I put on a gray-colored t-shirt, matched it with my gray pair of jeans and a pair of crisp black Nike slides. So what's it gonna be? I asked myself as I headed for the kitchen. Then my phone rang. Come on. I had to go all the way back to my bedroom to get it. Oh, crap! It was a missed video call from Tracy. I took a quick peek at the other notifications on my iPhone screen. Whoa, training had been canceled today. I look forward to kicking some ass today on the court. Lazily, I laid on my back in my messed up bed, holding the phone above my head. I quickly flipped through the other messages and hastily returned Tracy's call. In a couple seconds, her overwhelmingly pretty face was on my screen. She was still in bed. Rise and shine, sleepyhead, I teased. What are you still doing in bed? Waiting for Troy Maddox to come wake me, she laughed, displaying a well-organized dentition. I've been up for quite a while, though. Oh, really? I continued teasing. So, got any plans today? Not really, though. I'm just going to study until my girls come over. I'm guessing you're going to practice all day. Oh, no, practice got canceled today, and I was wondering if you could come over. I tried sounding nice. Troy, I don't know if... Come on, you'll still be able to study over here. I was almost begging. It's been a while since we spent some time alone. Days off are really rare these days, you know? She sighed. It was something she couldn't refuse. Okay, fine. But you're going to let me study, right? Oh, yeah, I will. I had an evil grin on my face. Come on, I know you're not. Don't forget to order garlic balls. I almost screamed out of excitement, but I got a grip quickly. I won't. She hung up. I placed the phone on my chest, staring at the ceiling, just smiling. Just as I was pondering on the blissful conversation I just had with Tracy, another call came. It wasn't a video call this time. It was an unknown number. I was in the early stages of stardom, and I was very careful about unknown numbers. But I was in a good mood, so I decided to take the call. Hello? Who is this? No response. All I heard was just some noisy static, crackling as though it was a radio from the 1940s. Hello? Who is this? I inquired yet again. Still nothing but the static. Hello? I didn't understand what was going on. I hung up. Crazy. I got up to make my bed, and the phone buzzed yet again. It was the same number. Maybe it was just a bad signal, I thought as I answered yet again. Hello? Still nothing but static. Now this was getting weird. Hello, who am I speaking with? Nothing at all. The static continued. My heart was racing. After a couple seconds, a horrifying deep voice spoke up from the crackling sound. "Maddox," the voice said. "Who the hell are you?" I barked back into the phone. The unknown caller had already hung up. What the heck just happened? I stared at my phone screen in an attempt to identify the unknown number, but it didn't match any of the numbers I had dialed in the past. How did he get my number? I thought it was probably a prank call. This was not the first prank call I had received. As a rising star, I was bound to get some of those. The call came in again from the same number. I became worried this time. I decided to pick it up so I could give the caller a piece of my mind. "Now listen up. Troy Maddox. The boomerang returns to its thrower. Karma happens to us all eventually." "Who the hell are you? You better..." The caller hung up again. With a feeling of fear and a pinch of anger, I tried calling the number. I put the phone right to my ear as I ran my left hand through my hair. "The number you have dialed is out of coverage." I didn't wait for the completion of that. Now I was alarmed. "All right, Troy, get it together." I took deep breaths as I gave myself a pep talk. It's nothing but a prank call. Stuff happens. I put my phone in my pocket and quickly put my bed in order. I walked to the kitchen, trying my utmost best to keep it together. Crazy world, I said to myself as I opened the fridge and took out a bottle of milk. I had barely turned when something hit the side of my head. I crumbled to the floor. My vision became blurry and I blacked out. As I regained consciousness, the first thing I felt was a paralyzing headache. Must have been from the hit earlier. Next, I noticed I couldn't move. I was restrained in a sitting position. I was tied to one of the dining chairs in my bedroom. I was staring down the whole time. I saw blood dripping from my face onto my gray jeans. "Hello, Maddox." The same deep voice spoke as I looked up to see who it was. "Remember me?" Who are you? What do you want, man?" I was a bit drowsy as his figure started to form. "You got my call, didn't you?" A guy who was about 6 foot tall with blonde hair was smiling as he took a chair and sat close in front of me. He was in an all-black outfit, a black leather jacket, black trousers, black shoes, with a pair of black gloves. "Look, man, tell me what you want." I couldn't think of any better words to say at the moment. "You've got such a short-term memory, Maddox." His smile slowly faded. "You don't remember high school days." I soon began to recollect. After some reasoning and some calculations, I knew who had assaulted me and tied me to my own chair. Mitch? I didn't get what he was doing in my apartment or even how he got in. What is all this about? He smiled. "Troy Maddox, I told you something on the phone." Yeah, I got it. Back in high school, I and some of my high school teammates would pick on some nerds, calling them names and beating them up occasionally. Mitch happened to be one of those unfortunate ones. However, he happened to be the one that took the most abuse. In one of our bullying expeditions, my teammates had beaten the shit out of him and shoved him in a locker. He wasn't discovered until the next day. "Even in the face of your doom, you still seem bold." Mitch's voice brought me back to the current reality. "You have no idea how you and your teammates ruined my life that day." "Look, man, we're sorry about that. I just wanted to get out of the situation. No true sympathy, though." "Sorry? You're sorry?" The apology seemed to infuriate him further. "You have no idea what you guys took away from me. You took what mattered most to me." He began pacing around me. Have you heard anything about the Impaler? The serial killer who's been... So it was you. I was quick at drawing inferences. Look, man, I was forced by my friends into beating you. The Impaler was a serial killer who had been on the loose for quite some time, known for brutally impaling his victims to a chair after gorging their eyes out. Looked like I was about to be another one of his victims. But Tracy was probably on her way, and I didn't know what to do. I'd been hunting down all those mean seniors everywhere. I'm like karma's messenger. He put his hands on my shoulder. And I've come to take away what's most important to you, just like you did. Please, come on. There's got to be some other way we can resolve this. Tears had begun flowing out of my eyes. What other way, Maddox? He was almost yelling. On that day, I wrote a script for a movie which was going to be a blockbuster. I was going to meet with producers that day. My life was about to take a new course, a new phase. But then, like a foul wind, you came along and ruined it all. My script was torn, and I couldn't meet up with the producers. They thought I was a non-serious kid, and they couldn't trust me anymore to get the job done. I was rejected, all thanks to you guys. But today, your deeds are about to catch up with you. He spoke with such an emotionless tone. I looked over to my dining table, and I saw a baseball bat, which is probably what knocked me out, and a long weapon which looked like a javelin. My heart raced faster than ever. Mitch, please. I was already exhausted. Your life will be spared, but I'm going to take what you love most away from you, your right thumb and your pinky finger. That way you can never handle a basketball again. He opened an attache case, which was on the dining room table. He took out a tool which looked like a plier, but had seemingly sharp blades. Mitch, please, you don't want to do this. Come on, let's talk things over, bro, please. Oh, look, I have an offer for you. My girl's coming over. And you think she can save you? Mitch said. No, I don't. You want a thumb and a pinky finger, right? Take hers. She's really close to my heart, and seeing her in pain will probably scar me for life. Hell, you could do more with her, whatever you feel like. Just spare my fingers. I have a career and a life ahead of me. Mitch smiled slowly, with his weapon in hand. He drew closer to me. I stayed patient. You are worse than I thought. Probably the worst person on this planet, Mitch said as he spat on my face. But this is an interesting offer. The next 1 hour felt like an eternity. Mitch groped Tracy as she entered the house. He beat her and took away her thumb and pinky finger. He then had his way with Tracy. All this happened in front of me on the floor. I watched all this in pure horror, but a part of me was at peace. My fingers were safe. As Mitch stood up to wear his clothes, it was my chance to escape. While he was taking out his anger on Tracy, I had managed to cut loose my arms. I mustered all the strength possible I could in my right leg and landed a kick to his balls. His face turned red as he fell to the floor. I ran for the window, and without any thought of repercussions, I jumped right through the glass. It wasn't the luckiest of days, and the glass pierced my face mercilessly as I landed on my lawn, crashing hard. I knew I dislocated something. I tried crawling, but I just couldn't. I was losing blood. I was fading yet again. Is this death? I wondered. The pain was the first reminder that made me feel that I was still alive. I woke up with pain all over, raging from cuts to scratches to bruises, internal injuries, and a dislocated shoulder. I was laying in a hospital. The nurse told me that I had multiple injuries, but eventually would recover. She warned me not to touch my face. I was so tensed and traumatized that the nurse had to sedate me. I soon faded away yet again. 3 months after the incident, I was making quite a steady recovery. My parents had come over to Memphis. My story was all over the news. Due to the complications, I had to redshirt the entire season. It was such a painful process. Mitch's words echoed through my ears. It seemed like a boomerang had returned to its thrower. Karma had caught up with me. The authorities were still after him. He was on the run. As for Tracy, I never heard from her again, but came to know from a common friend that she was shifted to a psychiatric hospital due to her unstable mental health and frequent anxiety attacks. My knees could touch the legs of the table, and I could feel the hardness of the wood through my pants. I shuffled a yawn. It wasn't time to yawn, but I couldn't help it. I'd been sitting in the hard chair for 2 hours, and my butt ached. I itched it to let my hands spread down from the table, but I couldn't. I blinked because I couldn't keep staring at Detective Sally's eyes like she was staring at mine determinedly. I sighed and drummed my fingers on the table. It had been 2 long, agonizing hours in her office. It wasn't a good place, far from fancy. This office was never on my to-go list. The walls were dull, and so was the ambiance. There was no food, and I was seriously hungry. Detective Sally's eyes trailed to my fingers and back to my face again. "So what are you trying to tell me now, Mr. Archer?" "That I don't know shit about Rachel's death," I retorted. I was aggravated. Spittle spurted from my lips. I was frustrated and sleep-deprived. "Watch your language, Mr. Archer, please," Detective Sally said with a firm tone. I sighed and wanted to stretch my legs so bad. "Let's go through all of this again." Sally tapped her pen on her notepad slowly. "You met Rachel at a bar last Friday." She paused so I could acknowledge what she said. I nodded slowly. "You had consensual sex?" "It was a one-night stand thing, yeah," I said. Rachel was cute and had a pixie cut, was blonde. Her hair was the first thing that caught my eyes. It shone in the bar's dim lights, and I took the stool beside her and ordered a New York lemonade while she ordered an appletini. Her voice sounded sensual and soft, like music to my ears. Her lips were red and plump. Her black dress fit perfectly on her slender, curvy body. When the barman came and gave us drinks, he was a scraggly dude with thick, shaggy hair. She picked it up, and I saw her long nails, shiny with red nail paint. I took a sip of my drink, held the liquid in my mouth, and allowed the tangy taste to spread across my tongue before swallowing. She took a sip too. She must have noticed how intently I was staring at her, so she shifted sideways and crossed her legs. "Hello," she said. Now I could see her face in full view. I could see how pretty she was. She wasn't that pretty in a generic way. Rachel was pretty in a Rachel way. I saw a lot of beautiful women, but it felt like it was the first time I had seen a beautiful woman. "I'm Archer Bruce." "I'm Rachel," she said. No last name, no middle name. She offered none. She was mysterious like that, which intrigued me. I offered to buy her a drink, but she refused, so we both ordered another set of drinks. We didn't talk about ourselves personally. Rather, we picked some random people lounging in the bar and talked about what people they might be. We didn't flirt with words. We flirted with body language. We stared each other in the eyes, and she smiled with a treacherously sexy smile. We must have exchanged numbers at some point or not, but it just happened. We had more than enough to drink, and we were borderline drunk. We decided to leave. We staggered out hand in hand into the streets of New York, into the blinding lights of a night. I got us a taxi, and we got in. She lived in a small studio apartment in the Bronx. We made out somewhat passionately on the sofa. She felt soft and sexy. I remember burying my hands in her short pixie blonde hair. We eventually passed out until the next morning. We weren't embarrassed by any sort, but it was my turn to babysit Adrielle. We all babysat my sister's kid. Adrielle was a nurse and a student. I didn't tell her this as I bolted out while fixing my belt. It was a one-night stand and it was already 10 a.m. I guess that was enough time for a one-night stand dude to leave. So what were you doing with her body? Her dead body in a tiny room hotel at Maplewood in New Jersey, 5 days later. Look, I said this a couple times and I'm sticking to it. She invited me. She called me and asked me to come over. And when I got there, she was dead. If I killed her, I wouldn't call the cops on myself. Calling the cops to the scene is a popular method we've observed with serial killers like you. I'm not a serial killer. Mr. Archer, we have some evidence. Your watch, your DNA, it's all over the place. Receipts to a credit card issued in your name. What else? I sit back inside. For hours I'd been questioned, and they had all these. I didn't notice my receipts were missing, but my watch. I have no idea how all those got there. I didn't even get to kiss her or have sex with her. Detective Sally stared at me for a while, adjusted her badge, and then signaled to the other cops. She was done. She stood with a swift motion and held my gaze for some time before striding out. If I wasn't this deep in this shit, I probably would have found her hot, but she was a cop, and I was trying to get my ass out of jail. My brother and sister, Tom and Barnett, rushed over to me when I walked out. "Are you in the clear now?" Barnett asked. "They found some damning evidence. I don't know how it got there," I replied. "What?" Tom asked. "Some personal stuff." I trailed as I tried to think of the possible ways I must have left them there. We stopped in our tracks, and my siblings gave me a questioning look. They trusted me, and I knew that they were wondering how my receipts got into a hotel room. We all got into Barnett's car. I picked up my phone from my pocket and powered it up. I had no access to my phone since I got arrested for calling the cops to the crime scene and spent hours at that shitty office. Messages flooded in my social media apps. I decided to check my emails first. Then I saw it. Rachel. I knew it was her. pixiebitch@gmail.com. It was definitely Rachel. "Hi, Archer. I'm sorry it had to be you. I wanted to end my shitty life in an interesting way. So I drugged you and had sex with you and took all that stuff that the cops found, including some of your hair. I wasn't sure if I was going to do it before calling you, but I had driven all the way to Maplewood already. So I'm going to pop some pills now, and hopefully I'll be dead when you find me, and you'll be reading this after your first questionings with the cops. I'm sorry. P.S. Your tongue felt so good on me. P.S.S. The cops will find more evidence." Then the screen went blank, and I couldn't find her mail anymore. "Shit!" I exclaimed. It was at that point I knew I was fucked. I didn't know what else Rachel had taken from me. The next morning, I was groggy. My head threatened to split in half from the pain that it was writhing in. It felt like a hangover, but I was just sleep deprived. I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned all night. I couldn't leave New York. I had been told to stay within the city until the investigations were finished. I heard a knock on the door, and then I heard Barnett. "Archer." I knew who it was. Detective Sally, maybe some other cops. They found it. I knew I had to leave immediately. I wasn't ready to go to jail for a crime I didn't commit. "Isn't this against the law? You can't come in," I heard Barnett shout in her strained voice. I heard Detective Sally burst in, and then we were face to face. She held up a wide rectangular plastic bag with white lacy underwear. "Does this look familiar to you?" It was the underwear Rachel had worn the first night. I tried to keep a plain face, but Sally was a cop, She must have seen the flicker of recognition in my face. "We found it in your trunk, Archer. The game's over." Panicking, I stretched out my hands to be cuffed. Was Rachel really dead? Or was this all a joke? How the hell did Rachel's underwear get into my trunk? It could only mean one thing. It wasn't really a suicide. If it was, the police wouldn't be investigating it. I had been framed for murder, and I didn't have an inkling of how or why I was framed. I had my bets placed on silence. The tension in the air was palpable to the smell of the wind in the room that was stiff, clammy, and almost crude. I had a cigarette between my fingers, awkwardly twisting the butt ever so often as I imagined smokers would. I had placed it on my lips a couple times, and each time it left a moist char in my mouth. I loathed the aroma of it, but it was necessary for my appearance. I was in a bar after all. The men in there were loud, lewd, and intentionally provocative in more instances than I could care to count. I had maintained a defying silence, even after one of them had threatened to wash me in his glass of beer, a rather tall one, I might add. I had simply looked away from the man's face, memorizing his features in the dizzying atmosphere, and simpered. He was stout, standing no taller than 5 feet 9 inches. Perhaps it was this realization of his stature that made him compensate with an attitude towards a woman like me. Or maybe it was the fact that I was dressed, which is no excuse in any case, to deflect from my purpose. I had disguised my looks with a colorful wig. I had gone generously as far as I could with my lipstick. I had chosen a pink shirt that exposed my navel and a reddish skirt to match it. It suited my personality that I tried to channel, or so I thought. In any way, I didn't care too much for such things because I should have known better than the tight leather boots that I had chosen for the night that pinched terribly. The augury of terrible things to come was in the rowdiness of the crowd, and they had a lot to cheer about. It was Independence Eve, one of the times that most of the nation could all agree that we were indeed the greatest country on earth, and the only night of my life when hell visited earth at whim. I turned my eyes away from the intermittent cheers and stared at the whitest trail of smoke that snaked from the burning tobacco. It was almost time, and the pendulum in my head had started to swing back and forth between clarity and unrighteous thoughts. I steadied myself by gripping tightly to the edge of the table and took in long draws of breath. I had looked through the crowd once, and there he was, the same man who had threatened to wash me in his beer. The sickening realization rippled through me, and I was queasy from the smell of the cigarette. I lifted the butt of the cigarette to my mouth and took a long, drawn puff. I choked on the swirling sensations that ascended through my tight canal of mouth and into my nostrils. My left hand instinctively flew to my mouth, and I coughed lightly. I turned the cigarette and stuck the embers into the steel ashtray, watching it quench out noiselessly. But I exhaled the rest of the smoke and climbed down from the elevated bar stool. I took another furtive look at him and recognized the look in his eyes. I had grown all too familiar with it by this time in my life. I scrambled through the crowd as seductively as I could, and for every inch of my stride, I noticed his eyes on me. He was the chosen one, and I had no qualms with that. I had driven miles from my city just for that moment, and he had given it to me with no dent to my conscience. He stood up when I was by the door, and I sighed, flustered. I pushed the door from the bar open, and the late night wind crashed against my face with a refreshing aroma of unshackling. I stared up at the morbid sky, the moon and the clouds engaging in a game of cloak and reveal. It was time. "Hey, bitch!" I heard his voice, a distinct granting noise traveling through the cool hours of midnight. I maintained my silence and kept on with my trek, luring him on. I perceived he followed me because the heat of the company trailed behind me. I did not want to turn around. It was unnecessary to startle him. He would come to me. And he did, just as I thought. He bode his time just as I imagined he would. He stole as stealthily as he could, trailing me out of the vehicle-lit road and off to the path alleyway that led to the other side of the building. I made a bend, and he suddenly picked up his pace, fearing that I would get away from him. I kept on my track, masked by the steady blackness that colored the alleyway. My breath was shaky, and I wished that I had a cigarette by me. For some reason, it had made me still, and now, without it, I was a wreck of nerves. I heard his footsteps when he made the turn as well, burning with lust perhaps, because his heaving breath betrayed his position even when his feet were light on the ground. I merged into the darkness and waited on him as he walked past me. "How did she get away?" he cussed in a long stream of annoyance. His words were slurred, heavy with an alcoholic drawl. I hesitated watching him. Just as he made his way past me, I emerged, slipping out of the darkness in which I had been the entire time with a knife to his neck. "Hello," I whispered, catching a glint of the knife as it reflected off the moon. All of my victims had been the same, men driven out by lust for violence against women. My purpose was simple. Men who showed dangerous disposition to harmless women deserved to die. The last time I counted, the number stood at 15. "Hey, what are you doing?" he squealed in my grip. I wrapped my hands around his shoulders and locked him in. The coldness of his skin against my face was familiar. It was a minute before Independence Day, giving him time to witness it like they all did. I waited it out with him. He didn't struggle. I sensed as the fear of death paralyzed him. His utmost horror was my delight, and I relished it. "Please don't kill me. I won't trouble you again." He pleaded as the sparks flew, and then the country was thrown into a frenzy of celebrations. It was too late. I drew the blade across his neck quickly, and his vessels of blood squirted. Large sprays came out as he collapsed to the ground. He reached his hands out and groped it as I replaced the knife into my bag and wiped the blood stains from my fingers. He wouldn't make it. I knew it. So I turned away from him and continued down my way to the alley. The news the next morning was predictable as always. The news anchor would give some short detail of his life, name and age, and perhaps some family history. But most importantly, how he was now another victim of my blade on Independence Eve.
Oh my God! What's that in the backyard? This story is inspired from a viral video depicting a bizarre incident where two brothers discover a broken skull in their backyard. They seem totally shocked by their discovery, but that was not the end of their spooky encounter. There is some more crazy footage from the same video which I will play at the end of this story. The real-life video was uploaded by a TikTok user, Gus Melendez. The time was a few minutes past 7 a.m. Something was gnawing at me. It was a distant memory trapped somewhere in the recess of my mind. I wanted to think and recall what it was, but the movie playing on the screen was more interesting. "It's not another horror movie, is it?" Jake, my younger brother, asked. "Looks like it," I told him with a smirk. He groaned. On the TV screen, a dog was pawing wildly at the soil. His owner, a boy of just over 10 years, sat on the porch watching his dog dig frantically, like it was desperate to get to something buried in the ground. "Rocky," he called, "what are you doing?" The dog, Rocky, kept digging. "Rocky," the boy called again. If Rocky heard, he didn't give any sign that he had. He just kept digging. Intrigued, the boy came off the porch and walked down to the spot where the dog was working the soil loose. He hunkered down just in front of him. "What are you looking for, boy?" he asked. The dog stopped then and looked up at him. It was then that he noticed something in the soil. It was something dull white, just a little brown in some places because of the dirt. "Is that?" The boy reached for it and then withdrew his hands. He turned to look at his dog. The dog barked at him. The boy started to dig too, moving the soil away from around whatever was in the ground. As it was more exposed, it gradually became clear what it was. A skull. The boy pulled it loose and held it up to look at it. Just beneath it, the sound of glass panes vibrating rose into the air. It graduated to a heavy rumbling. An eerie blue light came to life within the skull. The boy threw it away and scrambled backward. Behind him, the ground burst open and a skeletal hand thrust into the air. "Go check who it is," I told Jake. "Mm-mm." He shook his head in a vigorous refusal. Somehow he had gotten it into his head that the ghosts from the other horror movies we'd been binging on since morning were lurking in different corners of the house and waiting to get him alone. I sighed and rose to get to the door. To my amusement, he followed me down the hallway to the threshold. The house key was in the lock, so I twisted it right to unlock the door and pulled the knob. The door swung back to reveal my father looking angrier than I'd ever seen him. We'd not heard him drive in, and that seemed to displease him quite a bit. "Why the hell is the backyard still untouched?" he asked. I pulled back, scratching my head. "What?" He took a step forward. He had asked Jake and me to clear the weeds which had overgrown the yard. We'd just moved into this new place, and it seemed that the old owners had cared too little for it in the days that preceded its sale to my father. Now, unfortunately, it fell to Jake and me to do the work they should have done. "I'm sorry, Dad," I said. "We forgot," he sneered. "You forgot? I bet you were in front of that darn TV all day and night, doing nothing." "We'll do it tomorrow," I assured him. "First thing." He shook his head no. "You will do it now, both of you." "Now?" "Now." The note of finality in his voice booked no argument. I had lived around this man for 20 years. That was long enough to understand his moods. Somebody had probably pissed him off at work. Now he was going to transfer his aggression to Jake and me. "What are you waiting for?" he asked. "Jump to it." Beside me, Jake shrank back. It was just 11, still young enough to be scared easily. I, on the other hand, had outgrown that stage. All his displeasure ever provoked in me these days was anger and the yearning for true independence. Unfortunately, I'd never get that until I got a well-paying job. Until then, I'd have to do whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted. "Come on, Jake," I said, and went round my father. The lawnmower and other tools were in the garage. Dad was yet to set up his dream tool shed in the backyard. I grabbed the lawnmower. "Get that digger, Jake." "What's it for?" he asked. "Stumps," I told him. "For the stubborn shrubs." He picked it up and followed me out of the house. I turned on the mower and started to cut down the weeds in earnest. The shrubs which lined the side of the house would come later. Jake sat and watched as I mowed the grass. When I was done, I took the digger from him and started to uproot the shrubs. It was as I dug up the second shrub that I hit something hard. I stopped and checked to see what rock had lodged itself beneath the plant. But it wasn't a rock. "What's that?" Jake asked. I didn't need to dig it up to know what it was. One of the empty eye sockets was above the ground, staring sightlessly at nothing. "What's that?" Jake asked again. "A skull," I told him. "Jesus Christ!" he scrambled away. "What's it doing here? Somebody died here? Ghosts!" "Jake, will you chill for goodness sake?" I snapped. "It's just a skull. There's no ghost." "Where there are dead people, there'll always be ghosts," he countered. "You saw it in the movie." I scoffed. "It's just a movie, silly, not reality." That didn't convince him, so I went to the extreme. "I'll just pull this thing out so you'll see it's nothing." "No! Jake!" There was a moment of silence in which our wills clashed. After a brief battle, mine prevailed. Jake sighed. "It's dangerous." I hooked a finger in the empty socket and pulled. The skull didn't even budge. Suddenly, I felt a tremor beneath me, and the glass panes of the house windows started to vibrate loudly. "What's that?" Jake asked. He rose to his feet and began to back away. "They're coming! Oh no!" "Nobody is coming, Jake," I told him. But I didn't pull at the skull again. Rather, I rose to my feet to inspect the window. The glass panes were vibrating. Quickly, I ran into the house to inspect. Funnily enough, the room closest to the backyard was mine. I scoffed and went into the room to inspect. The window panes were vibrating here, and there was no one in the room. I went closer and touched them. The floor shook suddenly, and a distant boom rocked my psyche. I jumped away from the window, startled. Jake's voice floated to my ears from somewhere in the house. "Ghosts! Dad! A ghost is in the house!" I backed out of the room quickly, but the tremors in the floor followed me out of the room. "Oh God," I wondered. "What is happening?" "Dad!" Jake screamed again. "Stay away from the window! There's a ghost outside! Its skull is—" "Shut up, you silly twit!" Dad snapped. I followed their voices into the living room and found Dad standing by the window with his hand on the panes. Jake was sitting on the sofa with his hands folded tightly around himself. "It's just an earthquake," Dad announced. "It's my first month in this town, and the godforsaken earthquake couldn't even wait." Even though I hated how he spat the words at my brother, they brought me relief. I sat next to Jake and pulled him into my arms. "It's just an earthquake, like he said," I told him. "Just give it a minute. It'll pass." The tremors stopped then, and everything became still. Now it was my turn to tell Dad something he didn't like. "There's a skull in your backyard, by the way," I said. "I just thought you should know."
I just have a couple questions for you. Are you sure? Are you positive? I just have a couple questions for you. Are you sure?
This Ring camera footage of a creepy man was shared by Moncoco on TikTok. As you can see, this man shows up unannounced at the house. "You sure? You positive? Just have a couple of questions for you." Yes, she is 200% positive. She's not letting you in. This is what nightmares are made of. Forgetting to lock my front door was my problem. I would enter the house, remove my shoes, toss my bag, and completely forget to lock my door. But that didn't happen to me anymore. Not after I almost got... I arrived home from work, tired and worn out. I loved my job, but I could not overlook the fact that it made me tired every time. On this particular day, though, once I entered my house, my hands inadvertently went to the lock and I shut the door. Perhaps it was because I hoped to catch some sleep rather than watch TV as always. I went to the kitchen to prepare some food for myself. I lived alone and still tried my best to feed myself well. To be honest, it wasn't too tough for me. My parents were kind enough to provide me with this house. I was on the sofa in the sitting room, sorting through my bag, when I heard a knock on the door. The knock was weird, very weird. My house was the last on the street, and no one ever came to visit. Not since I broke up with my boyfriend over 2 years ago. He was the only one who ever showed up at bizarre times, and I didn't mind because I was head over heels for him. But he broke up with me. The thing was, Jason never knocked. My door was always open. It was because of him that I never really learned how to lock my door behind me. I was made to learn that he was no different from the other men, though. The way he shattered my heart into pieces and never looked back since. This ruled out the possibility that Jason was the one at the door. That still didn't explain who was knocking at my door looking for me. Or were they at the wrong house? I knew it couldn't be someone from my office either because I hated visitors. So I wrote the address of my parents in the office bio. The knock on the door continued, and fear was starting to grip me. I stared at the door, not knowing how to react. I didn't know how to respond, whether to shout or call the emergency line. I was confused. The knock sounded again, and this time, the doorknob turned. I knew because my gaze was nowhere else except the door. I would have sunk into the ground if I didn't remember that for the first time in ages, I locked my door after coming in. This gave me a sort of boldness I never really knew existed within me. "Who's there?" I shouted, but I remained where I was, a long distance from the door. I couldn't be too sure that whoever was at the door wasn't armed. For all I knew, he could be a robber trying to check if a human was in the house before he burgled. The stranger's voice was deep, and its sound made chills run through my spine. "Can you hear me? Please open the door. I have a few questions for you. Are you alone?" he asked. His voice gave me the creeps. It irritated my ears and caused the hairs on my skin to stand at alert. I was tempted to call the police. I couldn't move an inch. I asked who he was, but he didn't respond. He continued requesting me to open the door with an incessant intensity, and I got scared with every passing minute. He kept saying he wanted to have a word with me. I didn't respond anymore. I stood where I was. A million questions wondering what the man wanted echoed through my head. It would have been weird if I'd called the police to report him, and it happened that he was only there for a just cause. Once again, I asked him who he was and what was his purpose. He remained silent for a while, then continued to knock on the door and asked me to open up for him so that we could have the conversation face to face. I refused. I threatened to call the police and asked him to leave because I wasn't going to have any sort of conversation with him that way. I ran into my room and found a place to hide. I hoped he would leave when he got no responses. I hoped that he would go away, find other things to do, and leave me alone. I didn't know how long I was in my room cowering in fear at the stranger that decided to lounge at my front door. But the knocks ended, and the environment echoed nothing but silence. I came out of the room and peeped through the curtains to see if anyone was still there. My porch was empty. I didn't leave the house for the rest of the day until morning. I could barely sleep the entire night, too, for fear of someone coming in from nowhere. I still didn't know if the person that came was a burglar, or even worse, a criminal. Nothing much happened that night, and I slept peacefully. When I woke up the next morning, I saw my dad's missed call in the phone. And that's when I remembered something. At the time of handing over the keys to the house, my dad had told me that he had had a ring cam installed on the front door for his princess's safety. Now, I had ignored him back then because of his overprotective nature. I quickly opened the Ring app to check the footage. The man was as huge as his voice. He had a long beard, and he looked like what I would describe as ugly. He had strange tattoos all over his arm and wore a black cap. I didn't like his face, and I knew that he couldn't have meant well. He was not there for maintenance or anything useful. He must have come knowing I was living alone in the house. Goosebumps laced my skin. Could he have been watching me for a long time? Perhaps he knew that I wasn't the one to lock my door. I was about to stop the video when I saw him look straight into the camera like he knew I would watch it. I almost thought that he was right there, staring into my soul. "Lucky you to have locked your doors today." He smacked his lips and licked them. "We ought to have had a nice time together in bed. Maybe not a nice time for you, but you would have your pleasure one last time before taking journeys out of this world. Sex and death, a nice combination." He winked into the Ring camera. The color drained from my face, and I was weak in the knees. I knew immediately that I was supposed to report the man to the police, but almost like he knew I would, the next words he spoke were, "Don't you dare report it, or I'll come for you before the police catch me." I closed the app and immediately dialed my dad and asked him to come over. I told him the whole incident, and we decided to vacate the house immediately. Soon I shifted to a safe apartment, one where I interacted with the neighbors and I wasn't alone at the end of the street. A place where I got used to locking my doors. I never reported the man, but a similar situation never happened to me again either.
A cool breeze slipped into my room through the bars. I must have a visitor, and the wind, as tiny and unnoticeable as it was, had not gone unnoticed by me. Being in prison for a few years meant I had nothing to do except to follow up on some patterns. I sighed and let my mind carry me back to the past. In my house, one that I could still remember, cold wind slipped through the window and filled the room. It was not the slight wind like the hellhole I was in now, but one of freedom. I smirked with delight as its tiny hands caressed my skin. Immediately, my eyes opened, but I refused to get out of bed still. It had been a while, I thought to myself. On regular days, I would be dragged out of my sleep by the alarm clock beside my bed, but not that particular day. That morning was indeed a good one. It was July 4th, for God's sake. I could stay home all day without going to work if I wanted to. I took 3 breaths, closed my eyes, and opened them again. Then, I just sat there on the bed, staring into space with no thought in my head. I looked at a picture of Rachel and me that stood on the table right next to the bed, and I smiled. Rachel was the best thing that happened to me after the divorce I went through 2 years ago with my ex-wife. At the time, I was a complete mess. I totally gave up on love, but Rachel held my hand and led me out of the dark and into the light. I would have asked her to marry me already, but marriage was something I was still a little scared of. Though she was an angel, the total opposite of my ex-wife, I still had some fears. She could be here any minute, I thought to myself as I smiled from ear to ear, like a child playing in solitude with his toys. Maybe I was a child after all, her child, because that was the kind of love she gave me. Eventually, I got out of bed and walked to the window. I moved the curtains aside in a bid to get a view of what it looked like outside, but my eyes were forced closed by the angry rays of sun that met them. The sun was already at the middle of the sky. It was almost noon, I realized. The streets were unusually filled with people, and they seemed happy too. Most of them didn't seem to be in a hurry to get to a certain destination, as opposed to the other regular days. I got into the kitchen, made breakfast for 2, then took mine out of the kitchen and into the living room and ate it there, while I rewatched Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness. Wanda surely kicked some ass in that one. As soon as I was done eating, I turned on some music while I danced in according to my best. I slumped into the chair out of exhaustion and laughed lightly. I could not think of anything else to do, but that was when I remembered Rachel again. What could be keeping her? I asked myself. She was not the one to show up late. The day wouldn't be so much fun if I spent it without the love of my life. Quickly, I picked up my phone and gave her a call. Her phone rang multiple times, but she wasn't taking any of them. About 20 minutes later, my phone buzzed. "Baby, I will see you at night." It was Rachel. I immediately knew what it was about. There was probably an emergency at the hospital she worked at. Otherwise, she would have been here already. It was something I had already planned. A few days ago, we made preparations and plans to spend the entire day together. For a minute, I felt a little disappointed, but I simply pushed my feelings aside. Finally, I decided to take a stroll around the street, or maybe I'll go to the park to pass some time while I wait for Rachel. I rushed into the bathroom, had a quick shower, and threw on something casual. I hummed a song as I walked towards the door, but mysteriously, I heard something strange. A sound of something shattering. I ignored the sound at first, but I heard it again. Then, There was silence. I stood still for about a minute, waiting to hear the sound again. Then, I heard footsteps. "Who's there?" I asked, but there was no response. I couldn't figure out where the strange noise was coming from. Then, I heard the crackling sound of a door open. That's when I realized that it was all happening in the basement. I rushed back into my room and carried the baseball bat that I had lying under my bed for as long as I can remember. It was for days just like this. On my way to the basement, I dialed 911. I told them that there had been a break into my house, but I still proceeded to the basement. As soon as I got in, the door shut itself. Instantly, fear gripped me. I espied a shadow running behind me, but when I turned around, it was gone. "Who's there? Show yourself!" I screamed, fear creeping into my voice and causing it to tremble. The basement was really dark, so I could barely see clearly. I rushed towards the switch and attempted to turn the lights on, but they wouldn't come on. Apparently, they'd been tampered with. I slipped my hand into my back pocket and brought out my phone. I tried to turn on the flashlight, but something struck it out of my hand immediately. Terrified, I rushed back to the door of the basement, but it was still locked. While I was trying to break down the door, a dark figure rushed at me, priming at death, or maybe something worse. Scared to the bone, I swung my baseball bat wildly and didn't hit the invader. I swung it again, and this time, it connected with someone. There was a sick sound of bones being crushed, skull bones giving in, and a gasp. I hit 2 more times and watched the shadow fall to the ground. I stood where I was, about to piss my pants. What the hell was that? The shadow made a gurgling sound, like it was trying to talk. I picked up my phone from where it had fallen, turned it on, and froze. It was Rachel. She was trying to speak, but her head was knocked open, blood dribbling out of it. Too much blood. "Fuck!" I screamed, realizing that now she must have been trying to prank me. I ran towards her, but her eyes were already getting shut. "I'm sorry," I wailed. While I held her in my basement weeping, I heard the door open. The police were here. I leaned back against the prison wall. Throughout my trial, I had been so numb to say anything. I deserved it. I deserved this place. Still, the irony was not lost on me. The irony of losing my freedom on Independence Day.
A myth surrounded my place of work, and it had something to do with nighttime. I was never one to believe in myths because I considered them as stories that people use to make others cower in fear. It didn't make sense as long as one was courageous enough to live life like a boss. I was on the night shift at the 24-hour library, and being a book freak myself, I didn't mind. I have been interested in books since I was much younger, and my mother said I never went to sleep if I didn't read at least 2 books. She said I didn't allow her to read them to me, but I chose to read the books myself. Perhaps reading books was part of the reason that myths felt surreal to me and more like fiction. The library wasn't so busy, but there were still some students around. Most of them had exams to take, and others were just studious or book freaks like me. I decided to bury myself in a book too, since all I had to do was make sure no one left the library with any books without signing. It didn't look like anyone would do that. I stood from where I sat at the counter and skimmed through the bookshelves for the perfect book. That was when the library myth came to my mind. People, librarians, and library users there were fond of saying that there was a particular book that had a ghost attached to it. Anyone who picked the book, or even as much as touched it, or attempted to remove it from the shelf, was haunted by a ghost. Some said it happened for the rest of the person's lives. Others said the ghost haunted the person for 24 hours. It was believed that the ghost guarding the book was its author, Something about the author dying and his book got published after his death, but because he didn't want anyone to read what he wrote, he guarded it. I didn't believe it. How many copies could he guard? Or was there only one copy which existed? I observed that no one touched the book. No one ever moved closer to it, and the cleaners never cleaned it either. I was sure because when I got to the book's position, it was dusty and the book was lying alone on the shelf. My curiosity got the best of me, and I detached the book from the shelf. It wasn't as hard as I supposed it would be. One would think that a book guarded by a ghost would need at least a little bit of momentum to even touch it. I removed the book with no stress, and at that moment I knew the myth couldn't be true. I dusted the book and removed every speck of dirt. What improper treatment of a good book! It was a novel, a title I had never heard of or seen except in the myth people told. I took the book with me back to the counter and settled into reading through the night. It was a thriller about a serial killer who took pleasure in killing young ladies after they fell in love with him. The book was oddly satisfying, and I felt bad that everyone was missing out because of the horrible myths surrounding the book. As the duration of my shift came to an end, I was done with the book. I returned it to the shelf as the next librarian took over. I made sure to clean the shelf. I went back to rattle off to my replacement that I had read the book, returned it, and I was still perfectly fine. She shrugged and didn't say anything to counter what I had done. I figured my bravery was making her finally doubt the book ghost, and that was my goal. I left the library and drove to my house. It was still dark, but my eyes were tired from reading and staying awake all night. All I wanted to do was sleep after a refreshing shower. I entered my house, removed my clothes, and entered the bathroom. I brushed my teeth, used the toilet, and finally entered the bathtub. But instead of peace, I started to hear gibberish whispers, subtle, silent whispers directly in my ears. I could almost feel the breath of the mouth that spoke the words. I looked around, even with the perfect understanding that no one was with me in the bathroom. Of course, I didn't see anyone. I turned back to scrubbing my body, dismissing the feeling that overpowered me in those whispers. It wasn't many seconds later when I heard the whispers again. The words made sense this time. Love doesn't always last. Life doesn't either. My head banged as I realized where I had heard, or rather seen that line. It was in the book I read that night, the book people claimed was guarded by a ghost. The sentence was one that the serial killer in the book said every time he killed his next victim. The women that he seduced and made to love him. The women he slowly killed when they wanted to break up with him. I found it cool when I was reading the book, but hearing the words in my ears in the bathroom made me change my mind. For the first time in all 30 years of my life, fear enveloped me like a blanket. I rinsed my body fast. I concluded in my mind that I was only having hallucinations as an after effect of the book. I blocked out every inkling that pointed towards the obvious, the fact that the myth might have contained an iota of truth. I stepped out and came face to face with my mirror. Written in red letters on the glass mirror were the same words I heard in my ears. I would have screamed if I wasn't so frozen in place and unable to move any part of my body. If anyone had told me that I was mad, I would have believed it, because it felt like a better explanation than the myth being true. It couldn't be true. It shouldn't be true. I clicked my mind into action, washed off the letters from the mirror, and exited the bathroom. I found my pajamas and climbed under my blanket, seeking some form of comfort. But that spooky presence was everywhere. The whispers, the voice, the words. I cowered under my sheets. I started to regret my decision to read the book. My head spun in its position and my eyes were dizzy. I didn't know when sleep took me off, but I knew I slept because I woke up in the afternoon. I wanted to believe my ordeal would end that day. I desperately believed the people that claimed the ghost haunted for only a day. Not the ones that thought it was for the entire life of the person. The eerie presence in my house was gone. And when I regained my sanity, I resigned from the library and started to believe in myths too. Perhaps they were true sometimes.